we got all the way through the French and Indian War, right? So we got all the way through the French and Indian War, and what we said was, you know, when we actually discussed the French and Indian War in class, we put it into context. We said, oh, you know, this is the fourth of 4 wars for empire. It is a battle between England and her allies and France and her allies for sort of domination of the imperial powers, you know, and we said it's the final and decisive, you know, kind of conflict. But we talked a lot about sort of the genesis of the war. And in discussing the genesis of the war, you know, we talked about Washington and his role. And one of the reasons that we did so is because a lot of that happened around here. A lot of it happened in western Pennsylvania. This is where the war started. But I guess in terms of its overall significance, you know, I think you know, you could sort of say this. One thing that is significant is the Albany Congress. You know, the Albany Congress is 54. And in the Albany Congress, what's significant about it is that the colonists met together and could not come to an agreement of a plan for union, even under the threat of the French and Native Americans. So their own individual fears of one another and their desires not to give up sovereignty to one another prevented them from unifying for their own sort of safety, which is interesting. I think the other thing that's sort of significant about the French and Indian War is that eventually Britain turns the tide. And what turns the tide, I mean, at first they're losing and then they're winning, right? What turns the tide is William Pitt. William Pitt reorganizes the war effort, and in doing so, and in reorganizing the war effort, Pitt spends a lot of money, right? He spends a lot of money. And he puts the British Empire in significant debt. Now, the tide of war does turn. By 1760, the war is virtually over in the United States, and all that remains is the negotiations of a peace treaty, which is consummated in 1763, called the Treaty of Paris 1763. Now, I mean, I'm sure the Treaty of Paris 1763 that ends the 7 Years' War, which originally was called the French and Indian War in the United States, I'm sure that the Treaty of Paris 1763 has lots of stipulations in it. But the most significant was that France agreed to cede their entire North American empire. They gave up all of New France. So France ceased to have a colonial presence in North America as a result of that treaty. Now, here's one interesting thing. That treaty is 1763. And we talked about this, Kunal, and you probably remember how excited I was about this. Because we said, in the discussion about what to do, what to take from France, what not to take from France, there was some discussion by some people that it might not be such a good idea to cede or have France cede all their British or all their North American possessions. Because one of the things that having France in North America did is keep the colonists, the American colonists, dependent on Britain for protection. And some people said, well, you know, gee, if France is gone, maybe someday these colonists will revolt against England and seek their independence. Now, we said it was interesting that Benjamin Franklin, who was an agent for Pennsylvania, who was in London at that time, comments on that discussion. And Franklin says this: a union among the colonists is not merely improbable, it is impossible. So now, we were all excited about that. We were all excited. In fact, the reason we were excited about that is we said, look, this is in 1763. In 1763, Benjamin Franklin, one of the most prominent and well-known colonists in the world, right? I mean, when you say the colonists in the world, meaning an American colonist known to the world, right? Benjamin Franklin, you know, basically said there's never going to be a day when the American colonists will unify. It's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. Don't worry about it. And so this sort of set the stage for our question. And our question was, well, how did it happen? We know that in 1776, a union of the colonies, the Second Continental Congress, declares themselves independent. So how did we go in a 13-year period from one of the most enlightened Americans saying this is never going to happen to it happening? And I think what we discussed was that the four wars for empire and the fourth and final decisive war for empire changed Britain's colonial situation. I mean, clearly in 1763, Britain was the most powerful and influential country in the world. Their empire spanned the globe, right? But spanning the globe had resulted in some issues. And probably the biggest of those issues was money. Britain needed money in order to pay their debt that they had accrued during the war. Britain needed money to maintain the empire and protect the empire that they already had. And so fundamentally, they needed money. Now, and so in the aftermath of that war, we argued that Britain is going to take some actions to try to sort of deal with their challenges. And, you know, one of the things that they do is they attempt to tighten up on mercantilism. Now, Kendrak, in the last review session, which will be on the World Wide Web soon, in the last review session, will be on the World Wide Web soon, all right? We said that mercantilism was this sort of system where the government regulated the economic activity of the empire for the good of the empire. And we also said that mercantilism defined the relationship between Britain and North America. And we also said that mercantilism drains wealth from the colonies and it flows to the mother country. But we also said that Americans sort of put up with that for 110 years, largely because Britain didn't enforce it. But in the aftermath of the French and Indian War, they intended to do so. Right? They intended to more vigorously enforce mercantilism because they believed that they needed to. So one of the ways they did that is with the writs of assistance. Now, we talked about the writs of assistance and, you know, the attempt by customs officials in Boston to acquire writs of assistance, global search warrants, that would allow them to sort of limit smuggling. And we said that those merchants that would be subject to those searches hired a lawyer, James Otis, to argue that the writs of assistance were inappropriate, wrong. I don't want to say unconstitutional. But what Otis eventually argued, which becomes significant for sort of the American cause, is that the writs of assistance represented a violation of the merchants in Boston's natural rights. Right? Now, this idea of natural rights.
Mrs. Hirschberger, please call 5741. Mrs. Hirschberger.
This idea of natural rights and the violation of these natural rights becomes sort of a prominent reason that Americans oppose British actions. And we see this with the writs of assistance. And remember, we were excited about that too, because remember, John Adams is going to be at the actual trial where Otis makes his argument against the writs of assistance, and he argues 50 years later that right then and there the child independence was born. And how we said that you know, it's a pretty significant commentary by Adams, since he was so instrumental in the entire Revolutionary era. Now, in addition to sort of the debate over the writs of assistance, we also talked about the issue of westward expansion. And we said, look, Britain has problems. They have problems with the Native Americans on the frontier, even as the French and Indian War is unfolding. In fact, even before the peace treaty was signed, Western Native American tribes kind of revolted from the British in something that we called Pontiac's Rebellion, right? Pontiac's Rebellion. And Pontiac's Rebellion was bloody. Hundreds of people were killed. Property was destroyed. This was an issue. What was Britain's response to Pontiac's Rebellion? Controversial response. Go ahead, Colonel.
They established the Proclamation Line of 1763.
Right, the Proclamation Line of 1763. The Proclamation Line of 1763 said,
Mr. Wheeling, please call 5741.